Well, let's go ahead and get started. It's good to see bipartisanship already in action on the dais here. My name is Nathan Thornburg. I'm a senior editor with Time Magazine, and the panel that we're going to have today is called Building Broad Bipartisan Support for Service. We have a fantastic group here that can make just that point of how important, and not only that, but how to get it done. How to be an advocate for service in a bipartisan environment, which is obviously the path forward. To paraphrase a friend of mine, the panel needs no introduction, so it will get none. We are running a little bit behind on time. We're going to close up by 4, which is about 50 minutes from now. So I'd like to invite the panel to first start out, if they would, with a brief introduction of how they came to this issue and what we should take away from them on bipartisanship and service. And when Congressman Shays joins us, we'll bring him into the discussion as well. So if we could start with our very honored guest, Senator Dodd.
Thank you very much. Just use this right
I think just that microphone.
Well, first of all, let me repeat what I said upstairs. We thank the organizers. This has been a fabulous gathering, and received obviously tremendous national attention last evening with John McCain and Barack Obama laying out. Time Magazine deserves a great deal of credit for highlighting this program on the cover of your magazine and talking about it, and obviously the other organizations from Target and AARP, and I'm very relieved to leave somebody out here. I apologize for their backing of all of this. And I heard I was a former Peace Corps volunteer. I was thinking, listening to the general, having served in the Peace Corps back in the early 60s, and then coming back and going off to Fort Dix, New Jersey as an E1 private in basic training, and so having done both Peace Corps service and military service. There weren't a lot of us who did that in the 1960s, but having done both, and just I can't begin to tell you over the years. I mean, I always attribute my family as having the greatest influence on what I ended up doing or how I do things, but I quickly would add the Peace Corps afterwards. It was a life-altering experience. There's no other way to describe it to you. And so for those who are wondering whether or not experiences in service can have value, and others may tell you different things, it will alter your life in ways you can't even begin to imagine. And it alters the lives of then people you relate to. Not everybody gets to serve in the United States Senate, serve in the Congress, and write bills, and have that ability to influence the outcome of certain things. But whatever it is you do, and certainly I've maintained close contacts with people that I've served with over the years, whatever they've done as teachers or business people or involved in local government, that experience, whether it was in Vista or the Peace Corps, has affected their decision-making process, where they focus their attention, how they relate to people. So from the individual volunteer, the individual service provider, it is remarkable. What we didn't talk enough about, I don't know what was talked about before, so I want to be careful, is I don't think we've explained enough about the value of this in terms of practical dollars and cents. In a sense, what I was trying to suggest, that most people can tell you the story about John Kennedy giving the speech at that 2-line sentence at Michigan at 2 a.m. in the morning. Well, very few will tell you about the Cow Palace speech, where he talked about the Soviet Union and how we wanted to challenge as well and compete for the hearts and minds and ideals of people. They were sending doctors and nurses all over the world. We weren't doing anything like it. So that speech in the Cow Palace was a very practical application of the Peace Corps, aside from the level of idealism. And I think with domestic service, it isn't just about feeling good and doing good. It's making a difference. For every dollar we spend in terms of putting a service provider on the ground, there's $4 to $5 savings, either local tax money, state, or national. So there's a direct return in a practical sense from this kind of service as well. And I don't think we've emphasized that enough to people out there who wonder whether or not this is really more just a bunch of sort of people who want to feel good, do good, but really what does it really accomplish? And so I think we need to do a better job of telling that story about how everybody is positively affected, the provider, the community, and the taxpayer at large because of that service. And I think we need to complete that story if we're going to successfully convince members of Congress or the community at large to support the idea of service.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, and I'll make my speech very short. I got to know about...
Senator is a little longer.
It's your priority. I'm a nurse, right to the point, get it over with. But with that being said, I got to know, certainly about the different groups on volunteerism through the committee that I sub-chair on healthy families and communities. 2 years ago, I was proud to go on to that committee, and to be very honest with you, even though I had been on the education committee for 10 years, I was never part of that particular committee. And so when my colleagues elected me to it, I'm going, what am I getting myself into? And so I started poring over, all the issues that I would be covering and bringing up for reauthorization and getting to know so many things that were going on in our country. To be very honest with you, a lot of members don't know about. We concentrate on the committees we're on. We concentrate in what's in front of us at that particular moment. That's why we have staff, because they're looking at all those other particular issues, and when that issue comes up, they come to us, they brief us, they educate us, because there's not enough time in the day, the week, or the year to learn everything that you need to learn. But when we started to look at on reauthorizing the GIVE Act, which has to do with the volunteering, and the different corporations and how they were all coming together, I'll be very honest with you, I was amazed. I was amazed because I didn't know it existed. I knew a lot of people that volunteered their time. I know even in my own district that a lot of different groups were there helping people. And when we started looking at how many different groups were actually in the 4th Congressional District, I would tend to say that those that were a part of different groups didn't even know the other ones were from the other groups. We got to change that, because if they didn't know, how is the community supposed to know? And if the community doesn't know, how are we supposed to gain the support? So when we come up from reauthorization or we're trying to expand the program, and so here's a member of Congress that got an education over a year on trying to get the GIVE Act onto the floor, trying to get the money to increase the amount of monies out there, because I agree with Senator Dodd. For the dollars we spend, the return is tremendous. But you have to educate people. And hopefully we'll be able to talk and expand about that during this 50 minutes. But with that, certainly Representative Portman, he's going to, hopefully he'll talk about the budget, because that's obviously where all the battles go. He's a good guy, but it's like all of us. I take home so much money a week, and this is how much I can only spend. Well, that's what he's got to do, and we have to somehow come to a compromise and come up to an understanding that we want the program to go forward, we want the money absolutely, but you know what? If you don't have a compromise bill and you don't have members coming together on it, you have no bill, you have no legislation, and you don't go forward. And that's not a good answer.
Thank you, Representative Portman.
Okay, well, first, Nathan, thank you for being here, and for the organizers of Service Nation. This has been a neat day, and what a great coming together of a lot of different people. As Carolyn just said, we need to figure out a way to network better, and this has certainly been a good networking opportunity for everybody. As Congresswoman McCarthy just said, I did wear the green eye shade for a while, and so I do have a little different perspective. Being a member of Congress, of course, you always want to get your program not just authorized, but appropriated and push for funding for the things you believe in. And then you end up in this position on the Budget Committee, where I think you served with me,
I did.
but also in the Office of Management and Budget, where I was director until about a year ago, where you have to prioritize. And I guess I'd go back to what Senator Dodd said correctly, which is we need to do a better job of first analyzing and figuring out ways to accumulate the value of service. And it's sometimes intangible, as he indicated, with foreign policy. Sometimes it's very tangible, as it relates to providing services that otherwise would be provided by government at some level. So Congress is not always eager to fund some of the service initiatives that were talked about today. The legislation that Senator Kennedy and Senator Hatch are now proposing, that I'm sure Congressman Shays is going to take up in the House, and others, will be easier to pass as an authorization than it will be to appropriate, because there are competing priorities, and there is a very limited pot of money, increasingly so as our deficits mount and as there are more needs. So we've got to be able to demonstrate that there is a real value attached to it. When I was in Congress for a dozen years, I got to work on some service legislation. One piece was the anti-drug legislation that is known as the Community Anti-Drug Coalitions of America Act. And I actually started a coalition back home. I'm back on the board of it now. I chaired it for about 9 years. And it's a classic example of finding that balance where government provides the catalyst, but in fact, what you really are doing is leveraging service and volunteerism. And because of this legislation, which provides matching grants to anti-drug coalitions, which are prevention education coalitions around the country, we now have 300 or 400 additional coalitions than we had in the mid-90s when we passed this legislation. And therefore, literally hundreds of thousands of people have volunteered who might not otherwise have, because through this catalyst, we've been able to make great progress in terms of reaching out. Most importantly, we have results. In Cincinnati, we've seen our anti-drug campaign be successful, along with other things that are more national in scope probably, in reducing substance abuse by about 30% if you look at marijuana use among teens or other indicators. So it can work. And yet, if it were a government program from Washington, it wouldn't have worked as well, because ultimately it's about the school districts, it's about the local level, and there was a need to get it down to the local level, encourage volunteerism, not have somebody come in from the top and say this is how it's to be done. Every community is going to be different. So that's the balance I see we need to work out, is one, figuring out what is the value and therefore having it have a chance in the appropriations process and the budget process, and the second is figuring out ways to have the government be a creative and innovative partner with the private sector, and it's always going to be a balance. Thank you.
Thank you. Next we have Giselle Jones.
Hi. Wow. Hi. Actually, I like to start by telling people I'm what you call the return on an investment. Everything that we talked about in this panel today, how much money we put into it, how much time we put into it, how we expand it, I'm the return on that investment. And my job on this panel today is not just to share with you how I got to Public Allies and my experiences, but really to be that living testimony that's needed in order to drive this home. So if anybody is unsure about what the point of this discussion is, I'm here to just leverage that information and just share it with you, because I think that is a conversation that's worth having.
My wife would say, "Go, girl."
It's a conversation that's worth having, and that's what I'm here to do.
Thank you.
I'm sorry?
Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, tell us what you're about. Okay.
Sorry, put you on the spot.
That's all right. I'm accustomed to that. Actually, one of the ways I got to Public Allies New York, I'm proud to say I am part of the inaugural class of Public Allies New York in 1999. And I got to Public Allies because I was aging out of foster care. I was 21, working on a job that was $5.15, and when I finally got a raise, it was $5.25, and I had an apartment that I needed to pay, and I was not going to be homeless again. And I was aging out August 7, and Public Allies was starting September 9. So for me, I always tell people Public Allies New York created the bridge between foster care and doing public service and kept me from being homeless. At least for that 10 months, I was able to develop some core skills that has now propelled me to continue to follow my passion. So that's where my background lies.
And I should also mention that Giselle, and since then, has become a leader in a Public Allies program. Can you tell us just a little bit about?
You want to know what Public Allies did for me after, right? Well, let's put it this way. When I talk about being the return on investment, if it wasn't for Public Allies, I would never have learned that I had the potential to really serve my community the way I did. When I got to Public Allies, I stayed for the first 6 months, and I failed in the first program I was placed in. Failed. Got sent home. And there were a team of young people who they were determined that we were going to make it a success, and they were determined to stand by each and every one of us. And so after I left Public Allies, I was able to go and start a program in New York called Voices of Youth, and I was able to give my energy back to serving young people in foster care. I did that for the next 8-9 years. And now I am working as a consultant with the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and I'm serving 3 sites right now: Cleveland, Cuyahoga County, Cleveland, Guilford County, North Carolina, and in January, I'll pick up Louisville, Kentucky. And my job is really to help them engage young people in the child welfare system about making their stories known. And that's the leverage that Public Allies gave to me.
Fantastic, thank you. Finally, Ann Moore Connolly.
Thank you, Nathan. And Giselle, thank you for being here, and thank you for your service, and thank all of you for being here. We're really grateful. I am with City Year, and I got my start in this business as a Jesuit volunteer 20 years ago, and have been working on national service in our country ever since. And so I've been through many of the ups and downs related to federal funding for national service and trying to really increase bipartisan support. I actually first learned about national service when I read a pamphlet that was written by Franklin Thomas. It was a speech he had given at the Ford Foundation many years ago. And at the time, shortly thereafter, I think Bill Buckley wrote a book called Gratitude. And so I sort of didn't get that there wasn't this bipartisan support until AmeriCorps actually came into existence, and I realized that in fact, we had a lot of work to do to really educate people about the power of the idea and the program. And so just to echo sort of batting cleanup here, I think it is all about sharing stories and ensuring that members of Congress who have really busy plates and a lot of issues they have to cover understand the impact not only on the folks who serve like Giselle, but also the impact they have on the people they serve. Congressman Portman was talking about the challenge of available resources and the many, many needs that the country has. And I think we just, as a field, as a national service field, we haven't done a good enough job of sharing our stories and helping people see the impact that we have on the young people and the not so young people who serve, and also on the communities they serve. So I would say that for me, we learned a lot during the Save AmeriCorps crisis. Most of you will remember back in 2003 when there was a pretty devastating budget cut to AmeriCorps. And what really came out of that was a clear sense, after we started telling the story of what would happen without that funding, of the way in which AmeriCorps in particular had really integrated itself into the community. It's a fairly complicated funding setup, but really it's become part of the heart and soul of many communities, especially many low-income communities in this country, and I don't think we've done a good enough job of telling that story. And we found a lot of sort of unlikely heroes in that process, governors who stepped forward that we didn't know understood what AmeriCorps was. And I don't know that they knew that they understood what AmeriCorps was. They knew the nonprofits that folks served through, but they didn't actually know that this was AmeriCorps. So I think it's really all about stories and educating people and connecting one-to-one as people. And having Giselle tell her story is much more powerful than any letter or form letter or sort of, form email you can send to the Hill these days. I think it's just much more important to make those human connections. And then the second thing I would say is that I think we need to think about our alumni. I think our alumni are a real powerful force in this country, folks who've served, who can tell their stories in ways that people who are currently serving can't. And I'm actually going to call out Aaron Marquez and ask him to do a quick commercial for Serve Next and share your T-shirt.
Hi, my name is Aaron Marquez, and I'm an alumnus of City Year and AmeriCorps, and founded an organization where we're on the steering committee for ServiceNation called Serve Next. And during the presidential primary season, we went up and chased presidential candidates, and Senator Cristado was one of the very first to sign our pledge to expand national service. And we went around with these T-shirts that say, "I pledge," and it has our Serve Next if I'm elected. And the back it says to expand AmeriCorps, Peace Corps, Senior Corps, and Learn and Serve. And so 9 of the presidential candidates signed that pledge, and now we're chasing the congressional candidates.
So look out. He's coming.
AmeriCorps alumni will be knocking on your doors.
Well, you already got him.
Well, Aaron, actually, could
I've
I
been more successful in the campaign with you.
can I ask you, Aaron, how many of the 9 candidates were Democrats? How many were Republicans? And did you get Ron Paul to sign too?
We got Mike Huckabee to sign, and then
Okay.
we got every single Democratic candidate to sign. And I think we chased Senator McCain quite a bit, and he made a campaign commitment that he will not sign pledges, but I think we saw from last night that he's supportive of the 250,000 AmeriCorps members, as he said last night.
Thank you. And finally, we do have Representative Chris Shays, who is a Republican who's been extremely active on this issue for a number of years.
I
Representative
eat
Shays.
the crumbs off of this guy's table, Chris Dodd, who has been at the very forefront of this for years, and what a huge loss for Carolyn and I not to have Rob Portman in the House, because what a great leader he is. Let me make a few points. First off, don't give up on Republicans. because in the end, you're not going to have it happen unless you have good support. And the amazing thing is, if any party should be promoting public service, it should be the Republican Party. But you get people like Rush Limbaugh who will take something to say, what do you mean you're paying for volunteers? Chris and I were both Peace Corps volunteers. We got better than a minimum wage in the country we're in, and we had housing, and we also had health care. And the argument was that somehow if you pay volunteers, they wouldn't want to volunteer. Well, his is a life of service, and I'd like to think that mine comes close to that as well. So that inspired us. Chris introduced Eli Siegel to me, and the President Clinton said he wanted AmeriCorps and he wanted to be bipartisan. I would make the argument of why you want both parties this way. You have an extraordinary piece of legislation and organization with AmeriCorps. And what it does is it's not one size fits all. It has state programs, so you have some that succeed and some that fail. Now, ironically, some Republicans use the fail to go after the program. And I had to tell some of my colleagues, let me get it straight. You want competition, you want to have creativity, you want people from the grassroots up, and AmeriCorps, designed by this president, Eli Siegel, allowed it to happen. And then when there's a failure, you use that against them. We shouldn't be afraid to have failures because you're going to have a whole lot of successes. And so my point to you is this. Isn't it ironic that a Republican would argue against earning, working for something that's given to you? Educational credits. So what would and I'm talking to you in terms of communicating with Republicans, who I think I still have some understanding of, and say to me, let me get this straight. Don't you think people should earn what they get? Well, that's what we do. I mean, we used to be the biggest promoters of the Conservation Corps and others. Get people out into the wilderness working, learning how to work, being creative. And one paid volunteer can leverage thousands of volunteers who get nothing in return. So I want to make the point to you that both parties have its extremes, and when the extremes start to rule the party, you know the party's in trouble. I think my party has been given such a shake-up that they know it can't be that way. And so I'll end by this point. When you are talking to a member of Congress, think of all the issues that a Chris Dodd has to work with. Now, he's had lots of experience, so he knows the issues. But I say, being a member of Congress is like going to a large university, being told you have to take every course and get a passing grade. So we tend to know a little about a lot of things and focus on a few things. So when you are with that member, explain to him, don't assume they understand what we're talking about by public service. Explain to them, let them feel your passion, let them feel your respect for them, and in the end, you win, the country wins. Public service is the very backbone of what has made America great. That's a fact. It's a fact, and we should just rejoice in it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And I'd like to start out and have the panel weigh in on something that occurred to me last night, which was a fantastic plowed swords, I guess, kind of evening. Everybody laid their weapons down for one night and really got together on this. But a week before, we had the RNC, which brought us day 2 of the National Convention, was Service Day, in which everybody was very animated about service. And then day 3 was sort of mocking community organizing day, which showed that there is a very different vocabulary, and the Democrats are as guilty as Representative Shays points out at their extremes. I mean, the idea that Columbia University would celebrate service but deny the ROTC the chance to be on their campus. I think what you have is a country where one word, service, has 2 very different meanings. We have one party that sees service as a military and a patriotic function primarily, at least in the stereotypes, and the other party will see service as something along the lines of Peace Corps. Well, obviously we have living proof here that those stereotypes are not true. What I'd like to do in a concrete sense here is understand if we can get a bipartisan definition of service and try to get some ideas of what would be palatable to the Democratic caucus and what would be palatable to a Republican caucus. is a senior corps idea something that everybody can agree on? What about a clean energy corps? How do we narrow down? I mean, are there 4 or 5 areas that the entire Congress can agree on that are sort of crucial to service? And if anybody on the panel has some ideas about things that haven't gone over as well, or ideas that have really touched the hearts of both sides, I'd love to hear about it.
I'll mention one thing. When you mention core, to some Republicans, they think of ACORN or some organization that then is empowered, gets federal dollars, and then goes after Republicans. And so when you talk about a core, you've got to have some sense that it's not a partisan, ultimately become a partisan operation.
Is getting the president out of the picture, or having them not take the lead? Because I've heard AmeriCorps described as a Clinton program so many times, although Representative Shays was such a key factor in that program. I mean, can you depoliticize something if the president takes the lead?
The president has to take the lead.
Okay. Representative Portman.
No, I want to add some more controversy here, and that is faith-based organizations. I think in your list of sort of differences as to how people view service, one of the things that I ran into in Congress, and I know Senator Dodd and Congresswoman McCarthy and Shays have been through this too, we often push up against faith-based. And one of the bills that I worked on when I was there was the Second Chance Act, which involves a lot of volunteerism, prisoner reentry, and we just couldn't get over the faith-based issue. Finally we did, and the legislation was enacted about 6 months ago, but it really took 2 years because of faith-based. So it's just another issue where there's a difference of opinion on whether you have the government involved with faith-based organizations to encourage service. I don't have an answer, just throw it out there.
But I'll go back to what I said earlier, and that's basically educating people. You know, and it's perfectly true. You know, true when they first came up with the initiative of faith-based. You know, a lot of people didn't understand or actually know what did that mean. And we do that with a lot of our legislation. Chris and I sat on a number of committees together. We work very well. But it was really educate, even those on the committee, you have to sit down, and it's almost on a one-to-one most of the time, explaining to them. You know, I'm known for being the gun lady. I'm known for being the nut, you know, trying to take away everybody's gun. You know, and I kept telling everybody around the country, you got to take that word control. No one is trying to have gun control. What we're trying to do is reduce the violence in our communities. So, I mean, that one little word can turn people off or turn people on, and the key is to try to do that. But I still say that, you know, trying to educate members of Congress or on the local level, it doesn't matter what the level is. You have to educate and tell your stories, and I'll go back to that. You know, when we have our hearings in our committee and we were working on the GIVE Act, I brought in a number of young people that were part of these different organizations, and they talked about who they were before they even became part of the organization, and who they were when they finished, and what they did with the rest of their life. You know, it's a shame running, you know, being part of the government, I think, is the biggest privilege, and there's not one congressperson, I would say, or senator, that isn't proud to do the work that they do in the federal government. I mean, you know, you want to talk about, you know, a car salesman. We're worse than that as far as name recognition and everything. You know, and it gets kind of disappointing at times because you know what you're doing at home. You know you're working with all the different groups. You know that you're trying to help the nonprofits because they are the knit of the community. You know, and it doesn't matter what community you live in. I think there's only one community in my district. When I first ran, you know, I went around and introduced myself to every mayor, and you know, I said, you know, this is what, you know, I can help you with, and you know, this is what our office can help you with. And I'm not going to name this one town, but I went and, you know, met with that particular mayor, and he goes, "Oh, we don't need help." And I looked at him because he was the first one, and I said, "Oh, that's great." And he said, "Nah, we're so rich, we don't need anything." And I said, "Terrific, so I'll see you around." Well, a couple of years ago, he calls me up and he says, "You know, we need some help with a road," because things had turned, things had changed, and things change on a daily basis. And you got to constantly move with that change. And I said earlier, it's not even a member of Congress. We all have our great staff. You win over the staff, that staff member is going to get to the member. And then you go from one to one. I've been very lucky. I spent 10 years in the minority. I didn't get my bills passed because I was brilliant. I went over to the other side of the aisle and sat down every single day explaining what I was trying to do.
That was brilliant.
You got on a lot of my stuff.
I say, you're brilliant.
And I would sit there, and I'd come back, and I'd come back until I got them on my bill. I didn't get everybody. You're never going to get everybody. All you need is a majority, and your bill passes. So, I mean, so the word needs to be, as whether it's core, it has to be the language that people will understand universally. And let's face it, we're Americans. We've got a lot of different cultures in this country. You have the South, you have the Northeast, you've got the Midwest. I mean, sometimes you think you're talking to different languages. Everybody makes fun of me because I'm from New York. They think I talk funny. I don't think I talk funny. And at least it doesn't take me 10 minutes to try to get a word out. I mean, and I'll sit there, but you build those relationships up. And that's what all the different groups also have to do. You have to build the relationships up. You have to educate the people that you're working with. And by the way, toot your own horn every once in a while on the work. There's nothing wrong with that, to say how you made a difference in a child's life. Think about how many children we have in this country today that drop out of school and we don't see them again. Think about what's going on in any community that someone doesn't need a helping hand. So with that, it's very nice to volunteer. And as far as I'm concerned, anyone that volunteers gets 100% better, much more back than the person that has received it. Mainly because it's a give and take. And it is a give and take. I loved nursing. I was a nurse for 32 years. I got more out of nursing than all the people that I ever helped in my life. And you can't win every case, you can't win every bill, you can't win every fight. But if you're dedicated, you get up the next morning and you go out and do the same thing again. And that's what makes the difference. And that's who Americans are, by the way. We forget that. I mean, just think of what this country has gone through in the last several years. Whether it's natural weather, whether it, 9/11, we all came together. We all have that capacity. You just got to get away from that partisanship stuff. We call it the crazy season. As soon as the crazy season's out, we sit down, we all go out to dinner together. We're friends. We don't hate each other.
Speaking of which, I'd love to ask the Senator about one of the more unusual partnerships that has come out of this, which is your partnership with Senator Cochran. Clearly counterintuitive in a lot of ways. I would love to know if you have any lessons from beginning in this issue with him and how you've managed to keep that relationship as strong and as fruitful as it has been.
Well, the Senate's very different than the House in the sense that the rules are specifically written in the Senate to guarantee the rights of a minority, including a minority of one, the filibuster rule. Obviously, the rules of the House are guaranteed to protect the rights of a majority. And so despite what Carolyn does, institutionally, there's not a whole lot of rationale to necessarily spend time in the House. You don't have to. Once you control the place, now the numbers, you can pretty much do what you want. I'm exaggerating a bit. Whereas in the Senate, you just can't function. Nothing happens unless you have those relationships. And
then again, nothing happens.
Well, there's that problem. But the point of the question, and that is, despite there are people who I never vote with who are very, very good friends personally. The people I vote with all the time, and frankly, if I never see them again, won't be any great disappointment. It's not about whether you vote with people necessarily on matters. It's relationships. Thad Cochran and I have done a lot of work together. We've done all the work on trying to promote foreign language training in elementary schools in the country for the last 20 years. And so we have a lot of issues that we've worked together on. And this is one where he cares about the subject matter, and I knew that about him. He wanted to be involved in it, and so it wasn't any, great lobbying effort. I mean, part of the difficulty today, and this is far beyond the subject matter of your summit, but one of my great disappointments in the Congress has been that the institution, not as part of its rules, but by the nature of it, was designed in many ways to function on a level of comedy. And that worked for basically about 200 years because air conditioning didn't exist and you had to leave by June, so you had to get things done earlier. Probably air conditioning itself is the greatest single change in how things function. When I first went to Congress, you were paid for one round-trip ticket back to your district a year.
Seriously?
And so people came to town and stayed until the session was over. And so you got to know people. And getting to know one another cut through an awful lot of this.
Right.
And today, there's a significant, I don't know what the numbers are, but people who come down on a Monday night or Tuesday morning and leave on a Thursday night or a Friday morning. And they know each other in a committee hearing, or they know each other because they might work on a bill together. But never really develop that understanding of what they bring to that, what their appetites are, what their ambitions are, not just for themselves, but for the country. And that's changed dramatically. And I'm saddened by it because I think that's where an awful lot of this happens, is getting to know that your colleagues who you may have a disagreement with because you belong to different parties, you share an awful lot in common on things you care about. And so over the years, I've never, on every single piece of legislation I've ever authored, whether it was family and medical leave or the first child care legislation, Orrin Hatch was my partner on child care. Kit Bond and Dan Coates were my co-sponsors on family and medical leave. On every single bill I was ever involved in. I had strong bipartisan. You don't do it otherwise. So I guess maybe we don't celebrate that enough. I think too often the political season. If we allow this to continue, we will do to public service, elected service, what could happen in a private sector analogy. You imagine, if you will, that McDonald's and Burger King decided to go after each other in advertising campaigns, suggesting that if you ate one rather than the other, you were going to have terrible things happen to you. Not to mention what was in their hamburgers or what was in their hot dogs. What you would do, of course, and they understand, is you would destroy the franchise of fast food in the process. You might temporarily gain a market share, but ultimately no one would eat fast food. In a sense, that's what we've done to politics in this country. We're destroying the franchise of elective service through the tactics and the acrimony that so contaminates the political environment. So the average person says basically a pox on both your houses because we've spent our time thinking somehow that the American public are going to like one party over another because of the press release we put out. In fact, they're giving up on both of us pretty dramatically. Now, there's a revived interest because I think of John McCain and Barack Obama, this campaign. My only hope would be that it's going to sustain itself beyond this. And I don't know if that'll happen or not, but it's not terribly complicated about why people don't like politics and politicians. We've done it to ourselves.
It's worth pointing out also that Representative Shays, I know that you've made the case to your caucus colleagues that this is a matter of federal service also needing to be improved, that this is a big part of what service means. And I wanted to ask Ann Moore Connolly about this because I had read a study that showed that something like 60% of AmeriCorps volunteers end up in nonprofit or actually in government service. And Giselle had the honor of being highlighted in that study as an example of the leadership that comes. You should check it out, Giselle. It's very complimentary. As an example of the leadership that comes from AmeriCorps programs. But I am wondering if this idea of creating a better trained public servant as part of an overall service umbrella is something that is new and catching fire and maybe catching some attention on the other side of the aisle.
Sure. I'm going to ask somebody else to do a commercial in a minute, Chris, so be prepared. I think absolutely the studies are beginning to show that young people who serve in AmeriCorps or grow up in the service movement in some way are more inclined to be involved in either public service or nonprofit work. I actually would argue that I think obviously we need an incredibly strong workforce, and Chris can give you all the statistics about Chris Myers-Ash, who's working on this Public Service Academy effort. There are lots of statistics about the federal workforce and the turnover that's going to happen there, and it's a pretty devastating picture if you think about when the boomers retire. I actually think, though, that we need people in every sector who are educated about the problems in communities, who've been there as foot soldiers in the effort to try to solve those problems, who really understand deeply what communities are facing, and not just the communities that they grow up in, but other communities that need help as well. So I would argue that I think this is an incredibly rich career path for not only the public sector, but also the nonprofit sector. But I also think that we need to really encourage people to go into the business sector who have this kind of an ethic of service and can really infiltrate or infuse that ethic into their companies or their efforts. I think we need people in academia who really have a strong sense of service as part of the mission of the academic world. But I do want to ask Chris just to do a quick commercial for the Public Service Academy. I'm sorry I keep doing this, but I see people who have good stories to tell. So Chris, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure, I appreciate it, and Maura, she's referring to the U.S. Public Service Academy, and we have a lot of our volunteers are around, and one of the Army ladies brought up that question at the last panel. Basically what we want to do is create a civilian West Point, a civilian counterpart to the military service academies that uses the academies as a model for developing effective leadership. We want to focus with the Public Service Academy on the public sector. And I think Ann Maura is right to say we need service-oriented, service-motivated people in all sectors of society. But one of the needs that we see, not only because the baby boomers are retiring, we have these tremendous needs in the federal sector, but also because for a younger generation, I no longer can claim to be one of these, but for my generation and folks younger than me, when you say the word service, they think of nonprofits and they think of volunteering and they think of many things, but they often don't think of government work because government has been so maligned that students across the political spectrum generally avoid it, particularly students graduating from top universities like Columbia, where we were at last night. The percentages of students, even those who go to schools of government or schools of public policy, the percentage of graduates who then go on into the public sector has dropped from 70% in the early 80s to about a third now, partly because of the money and partly because of the culture. So we want to create a civilian public service academy. We have a bill in Congress. Chris Shays is our main Republican co-sponsor. We have 119, including Representative McCarthy. We have 21 senators who are on board. Senator Dodd, we have to talk to you. But it is a movement that's going on. Senator Clinton may talk about it in a little bit. It's an exciting movement. Grassroots movement has come up from the grassroots. I'm an AmeriCorps alum. And we have many young people who are
Chris and I
involved.
talked about the fact, though, that we would not want this new academy to play football against the academies.
Oh, that might be a problem.
Okay. I think I'd just been informed that Ann Maura unfortunately has to go. Ann Maura, do you have anyone else in the crowd that?
Well, they can all speak for me, so feel free to call on.
Well, I would just say, I was reading your biography last night, and we talk about a lot of organizations around a long time. The Jesuit Volunteer was a great organization, and that's a faith-based volunteer organization that just made a tremendous difference. In fact, in the Dominican Republic, where I was, there were Jesuit volunteers long before there were Peace Corps volunteers.
And they're domestic, too, aren't they?
Domestic, yeah, I served in California.
Both, yeah.
Yep.
So thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Ann Maura. We're running a little short on time for the rest of our panel as well. I did want to make sure to get to one thing. We're very honored to have Representative Portman here for a lot of reasons, but one is because he is a guy who knows at the highest levels how the purse strings work and how they open and why they close sometimes. I would love, since this is an action-oriented session and since we are trying to really progress this agenda, I'd love to hear from him how, if there's any way in a time of rising deficits that we might be able to make service a must fund instead of a, hey, wouldn't that be nice to fund agenda.
Yeah, Nathan, I think I have very little to add that I haven't already said earlier, which is we've got to figure out a way, as Senator Dodd said well, to attach a value to service so that Congress, when they're looking at competing priorities, understand that this is a way to meet some of the same needs that otherwise would be met by government. And, you know, it's difficult because every administration comes in with their own reforms. There was AmeriCorps, now there's Freedom Corps. Gee, what's this national service thing that President Bush 41 started? How does it all fit in? And one of the things I think came out of last night, as I understand it, was the notion of streamlining some of this. And I think that would be helpful to people. After 9/11, you know, there was a call to action for service in response to and in preparation for the potential for a terrorist attack, for instance. And it gained a lot of interest right away, but then I think it sort of got caught up in you know, some of the complexity of all the other programs, and how does that fit with Senior Corps, and how does it fit with Job Corps, and how does it, so I think there is a need for some coordination too. I think probably Carolyn and Chris can speak to this better than I can now because they're dealing with it every day, but one is attaching value, figuring out a way to calculate the value that is defensible, where you can measure it, and then second is, how do you, in a simple way, coordinate all these different programs, which oftentimes tend to go across different committee jurisdictions, which makes it complicated as well, and bring them together in some more concerted way.
And for the members who are still working on this, yeah.
No, it's very, what Ron pointed out is very, very true. And there's and what happens obviously is, that's why I think the architecture is important to support service and to create that sort of an umbrella organization without trying to, we do this in health all the time. We have, and I'm as guilty of it as anyone else, I suppose. I have a child with serious food allergies, so it isn't just a passing issue for me. So I'm very interested in whether or not we're going to invest in enough research in allergy questions. And to some extent, we need to be careful because we don't want to pick and choose winners and losers in all of this. But it seems to me our value is creating the architecture that allows for public service to be rewarded through educational incentives or other ideas, and then allow that wonderful, wonderful mosaic of various organizations out there that are performing invaluable functions, whether it's environmentally, working with children. I mean, there are all sorts of things that can be done. But rather than trying to establish all of that at some national level where you're going to try to sort that all out, I think is impossible. And what we ought to be doing is stepping back and creating the overall architecture that supports financially impacts institutions, like an academy, for instance, where you're not going to sit there and pick one particular level of volunteerism or service over another. And that is very, very important, or this will sink of its own weight. And you'll end up getting nothing done. So we really need to back up and look at this at arm's length on how we're going to orchestrate and organize this in a way that will allow for these various ideas to blossom. And it's not limited to what exists already. And if you don't, you end up competing with each other. The suggestion was, I think, by a speaker, I think she may be in the room, at lunch over the funding process. And you obviously understand it very, very well. And I sit next to Tom Harkin, who's the chairman of the subcommittee on HHS and the Senate side, and knows the appropriations process is critical. So we need to have a way in which we can do this intelligently, thoughtfully, and in a balanced way that will allow us to sustain, over the long pull of things, these kind of commitments. I agree with totally, Rob, on that.
Is there a caucus on service?
There is a caucus. That's the one that Thad Cochran and I put together. Thad is an appropriator and a senior, could very well end up chairing the Appropriations Committee. Is a senior Republican, or be the ranking Republican on the committee, depending on the outcome of the elections. And a conservative Republican who cares about the issue very deeply. But I can guarantee you, Thad will want to see how this works. And he's not going to want to hear about getting a shotgun approach with every organization seeking an appropriation somehow. And so it's going to be very, very important that there be some real serious thought given on how to structure this in a way that allows us to do exactly what all of us, I think, gathered here want to do. And that is to fund on a consistent basis the structures that provide for the service components to operate, and people to be able to fill those goals.
I think that's a fantastic end to this panel, just a call to action as we continue to talk about this on Saturday and in the weeks and months and years to come, that you present to Congress a simple face, one that's easy to fund. And I would really like to thank our panelists once again. Thank you so much for the time. Thank you so much. Good to see you. It's great to have you.